Hello, everyone. Welcome back to G Chats with your host, me, Giana, or G. I'm so happy to be back because last week's episode, if you did not know, was pre-filmed because I was on a vacation in Belize. Belize is so beautiful, such a beautiful country, beautiful people, amazing food, amazing water, amazing resort, like amazing town, everything. Like, I'm in love with Belize. I would go back for sure at some point in my lifetime. I'm so happy that my first ever vacation was in Belize. I absolutely loved it. So yes, I was there on vacation. I'm back. And although I miss the island and miss the sun, the warmth, the ocean, the turquoise colored water, I am happy to be back because in this episode, we are talking about something that's super, super important that affects millions of women every single year, and that is polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS. So this was recommended by people that I know personally on my own personal Instagram, but it was also recommended by a lot of my audience on TikTok. A lot of people want to know more about PCOS because it is almost thrown out there, literally like such a common thing that's thrown out and used by doctors, by people, by TikTok. Like it's something that's increasingly becoming popular, but I feel like a lot of people don't even understand what PCOS is. So in this episode, I really wanted us to dive in and talk a little bit about PCOS, because the thing is PCOS isn't just about cysts on your ovaries. It's an endocrine disorder, meaning that it's rooted in your hormonal system. And if you've been told to just lose weight or just take birth control, I want you to stick around because we're about to get into why those don't address the root cause of PCOS. So PCOS is a hormonal disorder. It's not just a reproductive issue or an infertility issue, which I feel like a lot of times it's made out to be. It's a metabolic and an endocrine condition / disorder, if you will, that throws off multiple hormones. We have to remember that the endocrine system and your metabolic system works exactly as that, a system. And when one hormone is thrown off in that system, then follows and trickles other hormones within the system. Once multiple hormones are thrown off, it wreaks havoc, literal chaos on your ovaries, your insulin levels, your metabolism, and even your mental health, which is where you start to get all of the symptoms that doctors and medicine uses to diagnose PCOS. And that symptom diagnosis is based off of the Rotterdam criteria. So PCOS is diagnosed using this, and that means that you need to have 2 out of the 3 of the following. The first is an irregular or absent period, a sign of an ovulatory dysfunction. 2, high androgens, which is typically excess male hormone, the testosterone hormone, which leads to acne, the growth of facial hair or body hair in places that it typically shouldn't be, or hair loss on the scalp, specifically like male pattern balding. And then 3 is cysts on your ovary, which aren't really cysts, and we'll touch on that a little more later. But the wild part is that you can have PCOS without having cysts on your ovaries. And that's something that I feel like is not talked about enough. We're going to touch on that because I feel like this is why a lot of people go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed, because the term polycystic ovary syndrome is a little misleading because people hear cysts and they think of one thing, and just because you have cysts doesn't mean you have PCOS, and just because you don't have cysts doesn't mean that you don't have PCOS. But anyways, PCOS, as I mentioned, is not just a fertility disorder. It's at its core an endocrine dysfunction that affects the ovaries, the thyroid, insulin regulation, cortisol, and stress. So I want to break down in this episode all of those functions so that we can understand at its core what is PCOS, what causes PCOS, and how it affects each of these hormones. So let's start with the brain-ovary miscommunication and why PCOS disrupts ovulation. So let's break down. In a healthy cycle, when your hormones are balanced, your brain and your ovaries communicate through something called the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, the HPO axis. And this is a hormonal feedback loop that controls ovulation. But in PCOS, this system completely gets thrown off. So the hypothalamus, which exists in the brain, tells the pituitary glands to release FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. And it also tells it to release and produce the LH hormone, which is your luteinizing hormone. But FSH helps follicles mature into eggs when your hormones are balanced and healthy, while LH is what triggers ovulation. So the issue is in PCOS, this feedback loop gets disrupted. So the pituitary gland releases too much of the luteinizing hormone, but not enough of the follicle stimulating hormone. And the follicles, what usually happens with healthy ovulation and healthy and balanced hormones is that multiple follicles will start to develop, but only one follicle will mature. And this one follicle that matures basically bursts at ovulation. And that is the follicle that dominates and basically shoots out the egg to get fertilized. But when you have this situation where the pituitary is releasing too much LH and not enough FSH, the follicles start to develop, but they never fully mature. So ovulation ends up not happening. And instead of one dominant follicle releasing an egg during normal ovulation, you will get multiple small underdeveloped follicles. And this so-called cyst is what we see in PCOS that shows up in ultrasounds. So PCOS isn't just an ovary problem, but it starts in the brain, which I feel like is not talked about enough. The miscommunication between the brain and the ovaries is why ovulation is either irregular or completely absent in many people with PCOS. So let's touch a little bit more on the conversation of the cysts, the quotes, cysts in PCOS and what they really are. So cysts in PCOS are not actually cysts. Okay, they're not. And I know that might be shocking for a lot of people, but that's because I feel like something was heard and then it was just taken and ran with. But let's talk about cysts and why they're not actually cysts. So when people think of polycystic ovary syndrome, they think of fluid-filled ovarian cysts, like the kind that rupture and cause pain. So I'm someone who has had cysts, those kind, the fluid-filled sacs that are on my ovary that have ruptured before since I was like in 7th grade. So I've experienced that. But those are not what we are talking about that are seen on an ultrasound in PCOS. In PCOS, these aren't true cysts. Instead, they are what we just talked about, the underdeveloped follicles, the tiny eggs that never fully matured due to low FSH and high LH. So that's the cysts, the quotes, cysts that we see in PCOS, not the fluid-filled sacs that are on the ovaries that a lot of people get. No, it's the underdeveloped follicles that one never matured and dominated. Now you just have a bunch of underdeveloped ones, and those tiny immature follicles get stuck in the dormant state, and it leads to a string of tiny follicles being visible on an ultrasound. This matters when we're talking about PCOS and why it's so important for me to include this in the conversation, because you can have PCOS without having cysts. Again, in quotes. And some people meet the diagnostic criteria without an ultrasound showing multiple follicles. Like that's very possible. But you can also have ovarian cysts and not have PCOS. Functional ovarian cysts, the ones that do rupture, are totally different from PCOS follicles. So the key takeaway here is that the name polycystic ovary syndrome is misleading. It is. And it's really a hormonal disorder affecting follicle development and not a condition of actual ovarian cysts, if that makes sense. So what we see on the conversation of the luteinizing hormone and the FSH is that the excess luteinizing hormone, when it's too high, it stimulates theca cells in the ovaries, and this leads to making too much testosterone, which is why a lot of people who have PCOS start to have excess face hair or chest hair or back hair. They have hair thinning, specifically male pattern baldness, and testosterone sensitivity at the hair follicles, and acne because testosterone increases oil production. So this excess luteinizing hormone that affects your ovaries and their ability to ovulate is in turn increasing your androgens. So you have high androgens, particularly the male sex hormone of testosterone, and now you have these symptoms. And some people with PCOS have high DHEAS instead of high testosterone. And we'll talk a little bit more on that later in adrenal-driven PCOS. But the point is that your androgens rise, and this causes the very, if you will, classic symptoms of PCOS. And on the topic of classic symptoms, we see insulin resistance and blood sugar roller coasters. So 70 to 80% of people with PCOS, they do have insulin resistance. But the thing is insulin isn't just about blood sugar. It also stimulates the theca cells in the ovaries to make testosterone. So this is where it gets so interesting, and it highlights how all of your hormones are connected, because I just talked about how the LH hormone affects testosterone. But now you're going to see how insulin and your testosterone is connected, which in turn is connected to LH. So everything is connected, which is why I said in the beginning of this episode, if you mess with one hormone, you mess with all the other hormones. So I hope that resonates throughout the rest of this episode, because you will see as we go into all of the common disruptions that exist in the endocrine system, you'll see that they're all connected. Literally, like I will bounce back between all of them. They're all connected. They all tie in together. So insulin, again, isn't about blood sugar. The theca cells in the ovaries are what makes testosterone. And this creates a vicious cycle, because if you increase more insulin, if you have more insulin production, you have more testosterone, which creates more symptoms. So that's why people with PCOS have the risk of type 2 diabetes and weight struggles, which have nothing to do with willpower and eating habits. It's, again, a hormonal issue that if it starts with your brain messing with the LH and FSH, this in turn can mess with your androgens, which in turn can mess with your insulin, and your insulin is further affecting your testosterone, and it literally just stimulates the overproduction of testosterone, and now you have this vicious cycle and roller coaster of these hormones just being out of whack, which then in turn affects estrogen. But here's the thing, estrogen is a little complicated when we talk about PCOS, because many people with PCOS have high estrogen levels due to an abundance of small underdeveloped follicles that still produce estradiol. And we talked about what happens when these follicles don't fully mature. But other people do have low estrogen because their ovaries aren't producing enough due to the excessive testosterone and the suppressed aromatase activity. So let's talk about what those fancy words mean and what's actually happening with estrogen. So PCOS is often called an estrogen dominant condition, but this isn't always the case. So it really does depend on which subtype of PCOS someone has, whether their body is still producing enough estrogen or not. And a lot of people don't realize that PCOS does have these subtypes, because PCOS is made out to be a one size fits all, and that's not true. Some people, as I just said, have high estrogen levels. Some people have low estrogen levels, and it all depends on where your hormones are at any given time, and when you catch the PCOS, how long you've been having these symptoms, and if your body is still producing enough estrogen. So scenario 1 is when you have high estrogen in PCOS, which is called estrogen dominance. And in many cases of PCOS, estrogen levels remain high because the follicles in the ovaries aren't fully maturing, but they're still producing, as I mentioned, estradiol, which is E2. And since ovulation isn't happening consistently, your progesterone will stay low and estrogen will remain unopposed. So basically, when you ovulate, what happens is the second that you ovulate, your progesterone is what like spikes. So leading up to ovulation, this is where your estrogen is at its highest. But the second that you ovulate, your progesterone basically like turns on, like it stimulates the production. Ovulation stimulates the production of progesterone. And this stimulation of progesterone is what in turn dips your estrogen. So your estrogen will immediately dip once progesterone skyrockets. The issue is if you are in a state where ovulation isn't happening and your progesterone never skyrockets, like it never does its like shoot of dominance, then nothing ever happens to that estrogen that climbs in your cycle, because that heightened and boosted progesterone is what directly lowers estrogen. But if you're not ovulating and you're not having that spike in progesterone, then your estrogen is untouched. Nothing happens to it. So now you have this estrogen dominance where the estrogen levels just remain high because you didn't ovulate. You didn't have that influx of progesterone. And this leads to a thickened uterine lining, which is called endometrial hyperplasia. You have heavy, prolonged, or irregular bleeding. You also have PMS-like symptoms like mood swings and breast tenderness. You have higher risk of endometrial cancer over time. So all of these symptoms are very common with estrogen dominance. But scenario 2 is when you have low estrogen in PCOS due to androgen suppression of estrogen. So if you have elevated testosterone levels and your male sex hormones are too high or chronically high, the issue here is that this directly suppresses and lowers estrogen. And some people with PCOS experience this, which again suppresses estrogen production, and androgens interfere with aromatase, which is the enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen. And so if aromatase activity is low, estrogen levels drop. And this leads to skipped or light and short cycles. It leads to vaginal dryness or low libido because estrogen plays such a crucial role in vaginal and cervical mucus production. And it also affects your bone health over time because estrogen helps maintain bone density, which is why the older you get and you go through menopause and you lose estrogen, your bones become weaker as we as women age. So this is like another case that's very common. And I feel like a lot of people don't know that PCOS can be, it's not a one size fits all. It can be both. It can be estrogen dominance or it could be low estrogen in PCOS. So that can lead to the conversation of how do people have a period without ovulating? And the simple answer is that you do not have a period if you are not ovulating. So in scenario 1, when we talked about estrogen dominance happens 9 times out of 10 because you are not ovulating, because you never have that surge in progesterone, because your LH hormone and your FSH hormone, they aren't functioning properly, and this in turn doesn't allow you to ovulate. And if you don't ovulate, then there is no period. You don't have a period. And if someone with PCOS is not ovulating but still gets periods, meaning that, and I put that in quotes if you're watching this, because it's likely that it's estrogen buildup followed by breakthrough bleeding and that it's not an actual period. So we have to get back to the basics of what a period is, because I feel like a lot of people think that just blood from your vagina means it's a period. That is not true. Any blood that comes from your vagina isn't always a period. A period is when you have balanced hormones that function normally and properly, and a proper function of hormones is basically your body every single month preparing you to have a baby. So what's happening during your menstrual cycle is that your body, your uterus is preparing during your cycle. It's preparing for an egg to get fertilized and implant in the uterus. So while your ovary is preparing a follicle and getting an egg ready, your uterus is getting ready to house a fertilized egg. So what happens is once you're in your fertile window and you ovulate and your egg is ready to get fertilized, your uterus is also ready to accept that egg. And what happens is when the egg gets to the uterus, so it travels from the ovary to the fallopian tube, where the fallopian tube is where it's ready to get pregnant and get fertilized. If it does not get fertilized, regardless if it doesn't get fertilized in the fallopian tube, the next step is the uterus. Once it gets to the uterus, this is where the uterus is detecting, did the egg get fertilized or did it not get fertilized? If it got fertilized, it will implant into the uterine lining. And now the uterine lining that's been preparing, it's been preparing with blood, stem cells, and vital nutrients to help support and feed this fertilized egg, this embryo and stuff like that. So it will then help feed and protect and grow this egg. But if there is no fertilized egg, then your uterus and your body recognizes there's no implantation. So it says, dang it, we didn't get pregnant. So now you shed that. You shed the nutrients, the egg, the dead tissue, you shed all of that. So in a way, your period is kind of like your body punishing you every month for not getting pregnant, basically. So that is a normal, healthy, balanced, functioning hormonal level and period cycle. But in people with PCOS who are not ovulating but still end up bleeding, this bleeding is because the uterine lining has continued to thicken in response to the circulating estrogen. So the uterine lining is just continuing to thicken in response to that excess estrogen. But the key here is that if the estrogen never dips and you have this circulating estrogen and this uterine lining that's thickening, eventually, I mean, your uterus can only thicken so much that the body is going to reach a threshold where the lining sheds unpredictably because it literally cannot hold much more of thickness, and it causes a quote unquote period that isn't actually a true menstrual cycle, but this is called anovulatory bleeding. So I think a lot of people don't know or recognize that you can't get a period unless you ovulate. And if you are bleeding, it doesn't always mean that you're ovulating, which is super confusing because a lot of women don't even recognize that. So it's possible that you didn't even ovulate, but you're bleeding. So you think you're having a period, but you're not actually having a period. You're having anovulatory bleeding. And that's essentially where you didn't ovulate, but your uterine lining has thickened to the point where there's a threshold that it can't thicken anymore. So it has no choice but to release some of the thickness and dump some of the thickness out. And it does that through shedding, but it's not shedding how normal balanced hormones will, if that makes sense. So there are some people who ovulate even with PCOS though. So that's a scenario where there's estrogen dominance and people don't ovulate. But there's also people who have low estrogen, but they do ovulate. And PCOS, that's the thing, is like it doesn't always mean zero ovulation. It literally just means a dysfunction of ovulation. So there's something off about the ovulation. And some people ovulate occasionally, even if their insulin resistance is mild. So people who do ovulate, this is probably because they likely, like, let's say, caught PCOS early and their insulin resistance is mild, because severe insulin resistance suppresses ovulation altogether. So if you are still ovulating, it's possible that your insulin resistance is mild, your androgen levels aren't excessively high. So there is elevated testosterone levels, but it's not like excessive. Less testosterone means that estrogen can still function properly. So if you have like crazy high testosterone levels, it's completely suppressing estrogen probably, and that is what's in turn going to affect your ability to ovulate. But if you just have elevated testosterone levels, it's not completely ruining estrogen, and so estrogen can still function a little properly. And this in turn can make your cycles long, but it still happens. So you could still ovulate, but instead of the normal day 14, 15, 16 time range, you might be ovulating at like day 28, day 29, day 30. That happens with some people. So you just might have super long cycles. Instead of like the normal 20, 30-day cycle, you might have like a 45-day cycle sometimes. And the thing is you can see this if you've made lifestyle, dietary, or supplemental changes, or if you've just caught in PCOS early, because PCOS is something that can be acquired. PCOS isn't always something that you're born with. We'll talk about that a little later on, but it's something that can be acquired because once you mess with one hormone, you mess with the others. And that is something that I feel like is not talked about enough. So you don't have to wait for it to be like when it rains, it pours type of thing where it's like awful. You can catch PCOS and manage it early. So the key takeaway is that PCOS presents differently in each person. It is not a one size fits all. And some people have high estrogen dominance, while others have low estrogen due to androgen suppression. Some people ovulate sporadically, some people ovulate regularly, and some people don't ovulate at all. And the severity of insulin resistance, androgen excess, and ovarian dysfunction all influence these hormonal patterns. So there is not one way that all of this works. Now, the reason I brought up that PCOS can be something that's brought on and something that can happen and something that you can acquire, and I don't think this is talked about enough. So as I mentioned, the endocrine system, let's back up, is a system and all the hormones work together. If you throw a wrench in one of the hormones, you throw a wrench in the other hormone. And one of the most common hormones that can throw a wrench in the system is cortisol. But I don't like the way, cortisol has been getting attention lately on TikTok, social media, articles, the news, whatever. Cortisol is not understood properly. The problem is that cortisol is called the stress hormone, but that gives it a bad reputation. In reality, cortisol is literally necessary for survival. It is normal to have cortisol. You need cortisol. The problem is that people don't understand how this hormone works, because cortisol is what regulates your metabolism, your immune function, your blood sugar, inflammation. The problem isn't cortisol itself. It's when it becomes dysregulated, either too high for too long or too low when you need it, that throws a wrench in the system that creates all of the other problems. And that is what's not talked about enough or understood enough. So your cortisol has a rhythm, and it works with your circadian rhythm, your sleep-wake cycle. So cortisol follows a natural daily rhythm, and this is known as the cortisol awakening response, CAR. And you have a morning surge. So your cortisol levels are their highest when you wake up. So about 30 to 40 minutes after waking up, your cortisol levels will spike. And this is what helps you wake up, feel alert, and it mobilizes energy. So it increases the blood sugar slightly to give you energy throughout the day. Now, what you see is that there's a gradual decline throughout the day. So after its peak that happens in the morning, it starts to slowly throughout the day climb down. And as it climbs down, it gradually decreases. And this is completely normal and totally necessary because it's now gearing you up for the nighttime. You don't need high stress hormones all day, throughout the whole day. It's meant to be at its highest in the morning, and it starts to dip. And then what we see is that low cortisol is supposed to happen at night, and low cortisol equals melatonin production. And a lot of you know what melatonin is, and that is your sleep hormone. So as cortisol drops in the evening, it signals the body that it's time to wind down and get ready for bed. Melatonin, the sleep hormone, starts increasing as cortisol levels lower. So this helps you fall asleep and it helps you stay asleep. But if cortisol doesn't drop at night because of stress, chronic stress, or poor blood sugar regulation, or inflammation in the body, melatonin production is suppressed. And this makes it harder to fall asleep at night. And this is why a lot of people with high evening cortisol, they feel wired but tired. And this is super, super common, and their body isn't transitioning into rest mode properly. So cortisol in PCOS is typically what happens and where things go wrong. That is the scary part, and that is where it can be brought on. PCOS can be quote unquote brought on. And I'm going to be using a lot of quotations because I want to emphasize that a lot of what we know about PCOS is evolving. I am someone that's always going to remain open-minded because PCOS is completely misunderstood. First of all, there's not enough money that goes into researching and understanding PCOS. So that's for one. But for two, because of this, it is evolving. The science is evolving and what we know is evolving. And all of this information is coming about us, and I'm someone who wants to stay up to date with all of this new information that comes out and is researched and studied for PCOS so that we can better understand it. A lot of doctors just think it's like a one size fits all, and a lot of scientists think the same, but they got to get with the time, get with the program, and start really forward thinking of, okay, wait, and questioning some of the things that they've been taught from 20 years ago and say like, wait, that doesn't make sense, and look into it and understand it. And not treat PCOS as a one size fits all, because for a while I feel like people just thought, oh, PCOS, yeah, a lot of people have it. Like, yes, it's just like a genetic thing and that's it. But like PCOS can be brought on because at the end of the day, it's an endocrine disorder, and you can unintentionally throw a wrench in your endocrine system by being stressed out, unfortunately. And that's something that's not talked about enough. Now that we know what normal cortisol should look like, we can now talk about when PCOS disrupts it, or when it disrupts your endocrine system. So studies show that people with PCOS tend to have cortisol dysregulation, often higher than baseline cortisol levels due to chronic stress, inflammation, and insulin resistance. So it doesn't have to be stress on its own that then ruins the cortisol. If you have something else, if it starts in the brain. Now remember, we talked about the luteinizing hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone, testosterone, we talked about estrogen. All of these things can affect then insulin, and if the insulin then affects your cortisol levels, that can affect your melatonin. So you see how everything in the endocrine system is literally connected. You mess with one thing, you mess with all of the things. Inflammation, it could stem from systemic inflammation that now triggers all these hormones to be off balance, and that can include cortisol levels. But for some people, it's chronic stress, and chronic stress will allow for your cortisol to be high all day. And psychological stress, inflammation, and blood sugar issues can keep cortisol chronically elevated. High cortisol equals high blood sugar, which equals insulin resistance, increased insulin resistance, which worsens PCOS symptoms. And higher androgens like testosterone and DHEAS can also keep cortisol levels too high, and this can lead to poor sleep, fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, depression, and more belly fat storage. Another phenomena that we see is the wired but tired. So let's talk about it. Many people with PCOS struggle with high cortisol in the evening, which again makes it difficult for them to sleep because it's suppressing melatonin production. So they feel exhausted all day, but they're unable to sleep at night. And it can contribute to nighttime cravings because high cortisol signals the brain to seek out sugar for carbs for quick energy. And unfortunately, another thing that we see is burnout and low cortisol. So if the body is under chronic stress for too long, the adrenal glands will start to produce less cortisol over time. This is known as HPA axis dysfunction, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction, and it's sometimes misnamed for adrenal fatigue. And these symptoms include extreme fatigue, especially in the morning, low blood pressure and dizziness, feeling like you crash after stress instead of bouncing back, and more inflammation and pain. In a few weeks, we're going to be talking about the pelvic floor. I have an episode coming out with the pelvic floor. A hypertonic pelvic floor is when your pelvic floor muscles are chronically tense and they're chronically tightened because you're stressed out. And if that stress allows for your pelvic floor muscles to be tightened all the time, what happens is over time, chronically tightening those muscles weakens the muscle over time. The same applies here. If you are stressed out 24/7 and your body is under chronic stress for too long, the adrenal glands start to produce less cortisol over time. And this is where you experience that fatigue and that dysfunction in the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Now, you might be thinking like, okay, given all of this, how can you support healthy cortisol levels, right? If cortisol is so important, how can we support it? So because PCOS and cortisol levels are directly affected, managing cortisol can actually help improve insulin resistance and ovulation and overall just hormonal balance, because you can support the endocrine system as a whole. So one thing you can do is try to sync your sleep and wake cycle with cortisol and melatonin. So getting morning sunlight is super helpful because that triggers a natural rise in the cortisol levels, and avoiding blue light at night, your phone and your screens, this prevents the suppression of melatonin. So we've all heard that blue light suppresses melatonin. So you want to try to avoid any excess melatonin suppression. If you're someone with high elevated cortisol levels, well, you don't want to, that's already suppressing melatonin. So you don't want to further suppress melatonin. So you want to eliminate a factor, and you don't want to use your phones and any blue light at night. Another thing is supporting your blood sugar to prevent cortisol spikes. So cortisol can spike not just because of stress, but it could spike because if the issue might be your blood sugar. So eating protein and healthy fats for breakfast instead of sugar, a very sugary breakfast, can help prevent blood sugar crashes. Also, avoid skipping meals. If you are someone, I know a lot of people think that sometimes when they're like trying to lose weight through dieting, whatever, they're exercising, a lot of people try to like skip meals, but it's not for everyone. And that is because some people will have low blood sugar that then triggers cortisol to release, and that messes with the hormones. So if you are someone dealing with blood sugar issues, which then in turn spikes your cortisol, you don't want to skip. You're not the type of person that can skip a meal. So that those kind of strategies, those diets, those meals, or meal methods, like they don't work for everyone. Everyone's hormones are different. You might be someone that can't skip a meal because of your blood sugar, because if you do skip a meal, your blood sugar will be low, and that low blood sugar will in turn spike your cortisol level. So you don't want that to happen. So don't feel like you need to skip meals to get the body of your dreams. Like that might not work for you, and that is okay. Understanding your body and what works for you is more important than anything. Exercising and all that, like none of that is a one size fits all, even though social media likes to make it seem like it is. And another thing is regulating stress response through the nervous system and supporting your nervous system. Your nervous system is so important. And one of the best ways that you can help regulate your nervous system and rewrite the story is by doing something like pelvic floor therapy. Your pelvic floor is so deeply connected to your female reproductive organs and your female reproductive health, which is in turn directly related to your hormones. And so breath work, meditation, and even like slow walks, light exercise that you can do with pelvic floor therapy can all help lower cortisol levels. And there's also, if you don't want to do like physical therapy, you can have adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandha and rhodiola, which is in with harmony, and that can help balance cortisol levels. You can also strength train and have movement, and heavy strength training is very popular for lowering baseline cortisol and improving insulin sensitivity. And you want to avoid excessive cardio because long sessions can spike cortisol further. So it's all about playing with what works for you. For me, I am someone who prefers pelvic floor therapy, and when I do work out, I like heavy weights. I'm someone who can't do excessive cardio. It just does not work for my body. Me and excessive cardio have never been friends. It doesn't work for me. So figuring out what works for you is so important. So the most important thing to remember is that cortisol, though it can be bad with PCOS, it is essential and it is not the enemy. You need it to wake up, to have energy, to regulate blood sugar. You need cortisol levels, but the issue isn't cortisol itself. It's when it stays high for too long or doesn't follow its normal rhythm. By supporting your circadian rhythm, balancing your blood sugar, and managing stress, you can bring cortisol back to normal levels, which in turn can help with PCOS symptoms, ovulation, and overall hormonal health. Now, since we've already covered cortisol dysregulation, we should also clarify how PCOS and thyroid disorders overlap, because hypothyroidism can mimic PCOS symptoms. So, PCOS is often misdiagnosed because many of its symptoms overlap with hypothyroidism, like fatigue, weight gain, irregular cycles. So, you might be thinking, okay, then what's the connection? Well, the thyroid and ovaries communicate through the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid ovarian axis. And if the thyroid function is low, it disrupts ovulation, leading to anovulatory cycles, low progesterone, and irregular periods, which is seen in people with PCOS. Low thyroid function slows metabolism and it makes insulin resistance worse, and it worsens PCOS symptoms. So thyroid testing is absolutely crucial for anyone that's diagnosed with PCOS. And many doctors only test the thyroid stimulating hormone, but a full thyroid panel, including free T3, free T4, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies, is absolutely necessary to rule out Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism. And that is something that unfortunately is not talked about enough because, as I mentioned, PCOS is very much seen as a one size fits all. I'm someone who discovered my hormonal imbalance struggle on my own. I felt to my core that something was wrong with my hormones. I felt it. I knew it. I was like, something's wrong with my hormones. And I remember telling my doctors that I felt this way. And do you know what they told me? They said to me, "You don't look like someone who has PCOS." There is a stigma about people who have PCOS, people who have hypothyroidism. There is a quote unquote look to these disorders. And I'm here to tell you that that is untrue. PCOS is evolving. We are evolving our knowledge on PCOS. It is not a one size fits all. It is incredibly understudied. So is hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. These female reproductive health issues and disorders and things that we see are all understudied, underfunded, misunderstood, misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed. Like, I could go on and on and on about that. And for that reason alone, we have to be our biggest advocates. You can bring on PCOS because one hormone got messed up for whatever reason. It could be your insulin, it could be your stress, it could be your estrogen, it could be your testosterone. One hormone could have been messed up, and that throws a wrench into the entire system. And now the entire system starts to go out of whack. But you can also catch the system being out of whack on your own and very early if proper blood testing is done. So it's very important too that when you do the blood testing for PCOS, that you also request the blood testing for hypothyroidism so that you can rule out hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's and make sure that you get to the root of what the problem is. Because again, just because you have elevated cortisol levels or chronically high cortisol levels doesn't mean that now all of a sudden you're going to have low estrogen or estrogen dominance or excessive testosterone. Like, all of that, like, it's not a one size fits all. I'm someone, when I got my blood test done, I had elevated testosterone levels. Because my testosterone levels were elevated, they weren't chronically high, they were elevated. This elevated, and it was abnormal because it wasn't in the normal range. My androgens were just elevated. This naturally lowered my estrogen. So my estrogen was lowered. This low estrogen also had me having low progesterone, which is why I started to notice a change in my period. My period was becoming lighter, and that was something that never happened to me in the past, but my period was becoming shorter and lighter, and that is because of the low progesterone and the low estrogen, and my testosterone being elevated was what was causing me increased facial hair. I was noticing hair on my chin, my upper lip. I was also noticing hair thinning, especially in the front, which is known as male pattern balding, which is something that happens when your testosterone is elevated. But I was not insulin resistant. My insulin was fine. Because my insulin was fine, I knew, I was like, well, if I do spike my blood sugar, and I already know that my endocrine system is effed up, this can now cause a bigger wrench in the cycle. So I did prioritize my diet, especially the most important meal that I prioritize is my breakfast. I knew I want to cut out. So before I was having yogurt with berries and stuff like that. I decided to cut that out and go for a more savory breakfast that is protein rich and healthy fat rich so that I could feed my body the necessary protein and fats that it needs and not spike my blood sugar, because I don't want to throw another wrench in the system knowing that my testosterone is what was high. So by helping my blood sugar and balancing my blood sugar and then saying, okay, let me go to my cortisol, because I'm someone who knew exactly what was causing my PCOS, and that was my cortisol, my stress. At the time, I was working as a biomedical engineer at a pharmaceutical company, and I was also running my business. And that's a lot. I basically had 2 full-time jobs, and I don't know if I've ever shared that with my audience, or on the podcast. I know I've shared it on TikTok, but I was working as a full-time engineer, a 9 to 5, and then I was running my business, a full-time job that it's a one-woman show. I'm handling everything at the time, from packing my orders to answering customers to making TikToks and engaging with TikTok comments and everything. It was a one-woman show. I'm handling absolutely everything, but also working a 9 to 5. So literally 9 to 5, I go home, I would eat, shower, and then I'd come to my office at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and I would work from 8 o'clock till 2, 3 in the morning, go home, brush my teeth, go to bed, but I would wake up at 6 in the morning to go to work. So I was only sleeping for 3 hours. I was never going in a deep sleep. My circadian rhythm was thrown off. My melatonin production was completely thrown off. So this circadian rhythm, the melatonin and the cortisol being completely off, then triggered my testosterone to rise, which then triggered my estrogen to lower, my progesterone to lower. And that's what was starting to affect my cycle, starting to affect the facial hair, the hair on my head. I started to notice these changes. So I was someone who was able to pinpoint it and be able to figure out what was going on. But I wasn't someone who was overweight, which it's so frustrating that doctors think you need to be obese to have PCOS. It's so offensive. And some people gain weight. I mean, I gained weight. I'm the heaviest, if you will, that I've ever been. I've never weighed this weight ever until now. So I did gain weight, but they look at you and they think that you need to have a full on beard. And some people do, and that's okay. We have to see that, acknowledge that, and care for that. But not everybody has a full on beard. Not everybody has lower belly fat. Not everybody is overweight. Not everybody is having hair thinness. Not everybody has just one particular symptom. Not everybody is insulin resistant. Remember, 70 to 80% of people are insulin resistant. I'm one of those people that wasn't insulin resistant, but I've completely reversed my PCOS because I've taken measures to identify what's causing this wrench in the endocrine system and figure it out. And that's what's leading me to what causes PCOS, because there's no single cause of PCOS. It's a whole mix of genetics, environment, and metabolism dysfunction. But here is what we do know. There are genetic predispositions. So PCOS can and does run in some families. And there are multiple genes that are involved, and many related to insulin and androgen metabolism. So some people do have higher androgens than others. That's natural. I have heard of that, particularly being Arab. A lot of people are oh, Arabs are hairy. And it's not that just oh, Arabs are hairy. It could be a predisposition, a genetic thing that in your particular family, higher androgens exists in your particular family. So that can make you more likely to develop PCOS over time. And there's also epigenetics and fetal development, because PCOS can actually start before birth. And a lot of people don't know this. If a fetus is exposed to high testosterone levels in the womb, it can disrupt ovarian development and it can lead to PCOS later in life. So a lot of people don't know that. It doesn't have to be just a genetic thing. It could be something that happens before you're even born and something that's not even your fault. And here is where we get to the topic that PCOS can be brought on by something that you did and you didn't even know, and that's the gut connection to PCOS. Gut dysbiosis is common in PCOS, and honestly, as science is emerging, we are seeing that the gut microbiome is connected to literally everything in your body, and studies are showing that an altered gut microbiome can drive inflammation up and insulin resistance. These two things, and again, that's why I say it's so hard, because you might not think, like, you're thinking like PCOS and there's this stigma of what it is, and you might not realize that inflammation in your gut that you brought on by accident because you weren't taking care of your gut health can lead to insulin resistance, which then can lead to excessive testosterone, which can in turn lower estrogen. And now this whole wrench and this dysfunction in the system gives you PCOS. But you wouldn't think that, because you're like, oh, like that doesn't just happen. But it does. It does. And your gut can be responsible for PCOS and chronic inflammation as well. That I put that as number 4 that I want to talk about, because PCOS is an inflammatory condition, because higher levels of C-reactive protein, CRP, and cytokines can worsen hormone imbalances. So there are many things that can be brought on that can trigger a dysfunction in the system, but there can also be a genetic predisposition. There could be an epigenetic thing that has happened. So there's many different things that can cause PCOS, but PCOS is slowly but surely being better understood, for a lack of a better phrase. And what we should discuss is how it's treated. The issue is as we're learning more about PCOS, you probably have heard or been handed birth control and metformin as a solution, but let's actually talk about what they do, because I don't think doctors explain how these drugs work for PCOS, because they don't actually get to the root of it. They help manage it. So let's start with birth control pills. So birth control pills suppress ovulation, which does lower testosterone. So it is good for acne and hair issues. If you are someone who's having acne, you're having the male pattern baldness or the facial hair, chest or back hair. If you're having any of that and you are taking birth control is meant to stop you from ovulating. And this in turn does help with the testosterone and helps lower testosterone, but it doesn't fix insulin resistance or the root of PCOS at all. And unfortunately, birth control pills can deplete B vitamins, magnesium, and it can ruin the gut microbiome, and it can make symptoms worse after stopping or getting off of birth control. And that's a really big thing. I remember telling a doctor before, because it was recommended, like, oh, maybe you should get on estrogen birth control, the one that has a combination where it has progesterone and estrogen. And it was, the thought behind it was, well, your estrogen's a little low, but your testosterone is high. So we want to lower testosterone, but give you estrogen. But I remember telling the doctor, if I'm giving my body synthetic or fake estrogen, when I do want to have children and I want to stop birth control and I want to get off of it, I have been putting fake estrogen in my body that now I've basically prevented my body from knowing how to make its own estrogen, that when I need it to make its own estrogen to support growing a baby and fueling and feeding a fertilized egg, it's not going to know how to do that. So I feel like I'm going to struggle to get pregnant, and that I don't want, because as of now, I have very regular periods and I don't have anything that's like insanely high. It's just everything is like elevated. I feel like I caught this early. So it's like, really, is it really worth like just getting on combination birth control and pumping in synthetic estrogen and stuff like that? And she was like, no, plenty of people get pregnant right after birth control. You'll be fine. Like everyone I know does. And I felt so dismissed. I was like, what? So I never been on birth control. I never got on it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to figure this out with my own scientific brain, being a scientist. We're going to figure this out. And here I am. I've completely reversed my PCOS and I created with Harmony for that reason. But that's my point, is that it's just a lot of these medications are thrown at you. Now, I understand like birth control has been a lifesaver. So two things can be true at once. Birth control can be incredibly misused by doctors and misunderstood, particularly in cases of PCOS, but it can also be incredibly helpful for a lot of people with female reproductive organs struggling with PCOS. So I understand both sides. I will never act like I don't get both sides. That's why I feel like having the drug is important. But what's more important is education and scientists and medical providers understanding PCOS and understanding pharmaceutical drugs, and then understanding when it is necessary and when it is not necessary. Because in my case, I don't believe it was necessary. And the fact that it was kind of like pushed onto me as a one size fits all, everyone with PCOS takes combination birth control, I just felt like that was like stupid and it didn't make sense. And I was like, no, this isn't for me. But for some people it is, and that's great. So two things can be true at once. But I wanted to make sure I highlighted how birth control pills manage PCOS and work in this condition. The other drug is metformin, which is a very common diabetes drug that improves insulin sensitivity. So it helps regulate cycles in some people, but it can cause gastrointestinal distress and B12 deficiency. The other drug that's used is spironolactone, which is a diuretic that blocks testosterone receptors. It's great for acne and hair issues, but again, it doesn't necessarily fix the underlying cause. So the thing with PCOS is you really gotta like find what is the wrench in the system. Like that's what like, and it is hard. I don't have an answer for you guys to identify what the root cause of your PCOS is. But what I do know is there's a lot of natural alternatives that are scientifically backed that you can use to manage all parts of PCOS. So remember, we talked about adaptogens for stress like ashwagandha and rhodiola. Another thing that I have on the list is inositol, which is again a natural alternative. Inositol is a B vitamin-like compound that improves insulin resistance and it restores ovulation in some people. So myo-inositol and D-chiro-inositol mimic metformin, the drug that's used for people with diabetes, without the side effects. So inositol is another great product or great ingredient that's used for insulin resistance. There's also something like L-theanine, which is very helpful for your stress levels and for the gut-brain axis. So those four ingredients, the ashwagandha, rhodiola, inositol, and L-theanine, are all in my product with Harmony because I wanted to make a product that helps balance hormones. And the thing that we won't get into today, but when your hormones are imbalanced, this directly affects your vaginal microbiome. And this honestly should be understood from last episode when we talked about a healthy vaginal microbiome. A healthy vaginal microbiome directly is balanced and healthy if your hormones are healthy and balanced. But if your hormones are imbalanced and abnormal, this directly in turn can deplete the good bacteria in your vagina. So for me, I was like, well, if I'm going to create a product for people with PCOS, but I believe in supporting the vaginal microbiome, you could pump in all the probiotics in your body that you want. But if you don't balance those estrogen levels, which is what is key to keeping the good bacteria in your vagina, well, then it's pointless, right? It doesn't matter. You could pump in the probiotics, but the estrogen is not going, if you have little estrogen levels, well, then you're not going to be effectively feeding the lactobacillus. And unfortunately, if you're not feeding it with the glycogen, well, then the lactobacillus is going to die. So I wanted to be able to restore and maintain the vaginal microbiome, but address the root cause as to why you're probably losing it if you have PCOS or any hormonal issues or you have a lot of stress and things like that. Well, it's probably you're losing it because of your hormones. So I added that 4 ingredient complex into the formula to kill two birds with one stone, essentially. So that's what's really important to remember. So the conclusion to all of this is to say that PCOS is not just about cysts on your ovary, despite the name polycystic ovary syndrome. It's a full body metabolic disorder. And the frustrating part is that most doctors do not explain that. But knowledge is power. And the more that you understand your body, the more control you have over it. So I hope that this episode helps you feel validated and equipped with real science and not just Band-Aid solutions. And as always, like, share this with your friends, your family, anybody that's struggling with PCOS. I just really hope that this gave you a deep dive, a deep understanding of PCOS, and helped you really just gather the information that's absolutely necessary for you to know and for your friends and your family to know, because PCOS is misunderstood. The information is still developing. We are still funding money into PCOS. We are still researching it. Like, all of this is still growing and evolving. So I hope that in a year or two from now, I can make an updated video on PCOS with like breakthrough information, breakthrough knowledge about PCOS, and breakthrough medical testing. I don't know. I don't want to speak off the top of my head and give false information, but it's possible even that there may be testing, genetic testing, to see if you have a predisposition to PCOS. I don't know if that's a thing. I know there's a lot of genetic testing that exists for like BRCA, breast cancer genes and stuff like that. I don't know if there is one for PCOS, but that would be huge, because then you could pinpoint like, oh, is this a genetic thing? Was I predisposed to it? Is it an epigenetic thing? Or did I unfortunately bring this on to myself through my environment, through my lifestyle, through my diet? Because that's very possible. So understanding the root of your PCOS will help with you managing it and treating it, for a lack of a better word. But ultimately, I wanted you guys to understand that it goes beyond just weight gain, beyond hair, balding, all of that. It goes beyond moon face, cortisol face, and all that. Like, those are gimmicks, those are trends. Sometimes the internet sucks, but I'm glad that I could make this video and promote real science and real education for you guys. So nonetheless, this is a long video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you loved it. I love you guys so much, and let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.